they gave cameras to the Navajo that they had been working with because they were interested in how they perceived their surroundings. And when they looked at the images they got back afterwards, they realized that it was a totally different perception or conception of the landscape that these native people had. So what struck them first of all was that almost all the photos that we would consider traditional landscape photography had human elements in them, which means domestic livestock or family, and it showed not people posing or recreating, but people doing subsistence activities.
Well, hey everyone. Welcome to episode 389 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week on the podcast, I sat down and had a great conversation with writer, anthropologist, and explorer Michael Engelhard. Michael has written several books, including one about his 1,000-mile traverse of the Brooks Range in Alaska, and his newest book, No Walk in the Park, which is a book about native culture and the Grand Canyon with a similar style to one of my favorite books by Edward Abbey, Desert Solitaire. In this week's show, you'll hear about Michael's take on landscape photography and how we could possibly think about it differently through the perspective of native cultures. Lastly, this podcast is listener supported. We do not have a corporate sponsor. I keep the show afloat using your generous donations on PayPal, Venmo, or ideally on Patreon. I have also created a producer's best of page for the podcast. The idea is simple. Those who have supported the podcast financially have put their seal of approval on various episodes, showcasing to the public the most highly valued episodes of the show. For every $500 in support, you gain a producer credit, which you can showcase on LinkedIn if you so desire. You're officially a producer of a podcast. Hooray! Each credit can then be used to promote an episode as being one of the most valued by listeners. I'll put a link in the show note to all of this stuff so that you can help to support the show and learn about the favorite episodes from our producers. Thank you to our latest supporters, Sally Harms, Mary Holdren, and Christina Guidi, for stepping up to keep the show going. Cheers. Okay, let's get to this week's conversation with Michael Engelhard. I'm really interested to see where this conversation takes us today.
Me too. You never know. It's like a hike that way sometimes.
That's true. It is kind of like a hike. I love that. Well, Michael, for people who are not familiar with you, why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm Michael Engelhard. I currently live in Fairbanks, Alaska, and I moved here in 1989 from Germany, actually, just a month before the wall came down, and I've never been back since, so I don't know how much the country's changed. I always wanted to live up north ever since I was a teenager, probably reading too much Jack London at a susceptible age. And I finally did manage to make a living here, moving to Alaska straight from Germany to attend the University of Alaska Fairbanks for a degree in Northern Anthropology, which they have one of the best programs in the world. However, long story short, I ended up dropping out sort of after getting a degree, and then by more or less coincidence, sort of slipped into a guiding career, and that was the next 25 years for me, working as a wilderness guide up in Alaska in the Canyon Country, and also an outdoors instructor in various youth programs. So that's what a liberal arts degree will get you these days, I guess. I'm happily married. My wife used to be a graphic designer, and now she works as a nurse here for the state. And I'm childless by design. That's sort of my contribution to the environment. It's one of the bigger things you can do as far as the carbon footprint, but also long periods of my life, I really haven't been economically situated to where I could raise a child and support a child barely myself. You know, that's sort of the downside of guiding seasonal work and so on that a lot of people never talk about. It's the less glamorous side.
Awesome. Well, let's talk about your background as a guide, an outdoor instructor, and a cultural anthropologist. How have those things kind of woven into your career and intersected?
Well, the anthropology was first, I guess. and I had an interest in foreign cultures for a long, long time. Then in 1982, after a short stint in the military, I decided to travel to the southwest of the United States, hitchhiking mostly, and ended up all the way down in Guatemala. I had some very interesting experiences along the way that kind of reinforced that interest in foreign cultures and made me want to learn more about them. But it took a while to germinate. But one of them was I spent some time with a Hopi family on Second Mesa. I got invited to their home and lived with them for a while. And then I also lived on a unpopulated island off the coast of Yucatan in Mexico with some Mexican fishermen.
Oh, wow.
But I wanted to stay in the United States that time, but I couldn't fight quite a handle on it. And then life took me to Munich and an apprenticeship as a potter, actually. And I had a friend whose girlfriend studied at the University of Munich, and we were visiting one day, and I just, out of interest, I checked out their catalog, what they were offering, what kind of course they were offering in anthropology. And they had great courses, and more or less spontaneously I enrolled as soon as I was done with my apprenticeship, and very soon developed an interest in Northern cultures. Like I said, that interest in the North was already there from a lot of reading about it, that I had done as a teenager. So I started specializing kind of on Athabascan, Indian, and Eskimo cultures. And then the next logical step was to want to, meet these people and not just spend my days in a dusty museum dusting off collections, but actually get into the field. And so I applied for a scholarship as an exchange student, ended up at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. That's sort of the backstory. And then when I realized I got my master's degree here, and then I was working on a PhD, and I had a problem getting funding. I shouldn't say that as a writer, but I'm a lousy grant writer. That might have had something to do with it. I dropped out of the PhD program because I got to the point where I said, hell, if nobody else is interested in what I'm doing, why should I be? For career-wise, it wouldn't make much of a difference whether I have a master's degree or doctorate. And that was the middle of the summer. And I also realized I was teaching some summer sessions for the university, and I realized that I wasn't the best classroom teacher. And also, looking back, I have not learned the really important lessons about life in the classroom either. So there was that interest in education, but in a non-traditional setting. However, it was summer when I finished at the university, and there were just not very many jobs around, and I applied for a guiding job down in Chickaloon in South Central Alaska as a river guide. And I did have an outdoors background already, but I had never, professionally guided people. So I trained there. They broke me in, and I really, really liked it. And like I said, stuck for 25 years with it. And then combined it with my educational interests, working for Outward Bound, anything from hoods in the woods, hardcore kids, to Outward Bound, and then college students in outdoors programs that give you college credit for doing these courses. So I worked as an instructor in those, so the whole spectrum. And the writing sort of happened along the way, actually. The writing for narrative and creative nonfiction, that was an outcome out of all of these interests. And I had already been writing technical papers and a master's degree thesis for the university, but that was a different kind of writing. So, and I can talk more about later when we talk about photography, how I fell into this whole writing thing.
Yeah, well, let's jump into that. What is your interest in landscape photography, since this is a photography-focused podcast after all?
Yes, and I have to preface that by saying I really do have a love for landscape photography, but I'm probably going to be one of the most conflicted people about landscape photography that you have had on the show and will have. My first publication was actually a text accompanying a coffee table book that sort of more or less happened by coincidence too. But I've worked a lot with landscape photographers on pictorials. It's a nicer word than coffee table book, because coffee table book makes it sort of like it's just a decorative ornament. And of course, as a magazine writer, I have, writing for magazines of various kinds. I have worked with photographers, but I've also provided my own photography because that's nowadays expected almost. They used to do a lot more illustrations, original artwork for magazines, but now images are almost a must. And unless you work for a posh magazine where they can assign a specifically trained photographer with a separate budget, you kind of like jack of all trades. You have to provide your own photos, or you won't sell. I also have written about photography. I have profiled various photographers, anything from Edward Sheriff Curtis to contemporary Alaskan photographers. And I even had 2 of my own photos that became book covers of my books. I use photography also a lot as mnemonic device out there in the field when I'm out and about, because it helps me. A photo triggers a lot of memories that happened in the moment, a lot of sensations. It's sort of like a different form of note writing for me.
That makes total sense. So I'm curious, you said you had more of a critical view of landscape photography, and I would love to dive into what exactly you mean by that.
Okay. For starters, it's like any cultural production, photography does not exist in a vacuum. We edit reality basically as in landscape photography, just like the writer edits reality. Also, it seems to me it's still largely dominated by the male gaze, and not just the male gaze, but the male white middle class gaze, I'd say. There are very few landscape photographers. I don't know, maybe you know more, but I have very little knowledge of landscape photographers, especially of the kind that I like, that are making it big out there. The same is actually true for adventure and exploration writing. That's also still very much male and Caucasian or Anglo-dominated, whatever you want to call it. I see so much nature photography now that looks the same to me. And maybe that's sort of kind of built into the medium to a degree, because you have all this refined software, people using similar cameras, and now post-production editing. So even average photographers can do pretty amazing, technically accomplished work, but it, to me, oftentimes lacks the creative spark. And I compare that to writing, and I can't help but thinking that it might be because as a writer, we have access to more dimensions than photographers. We have different sensations other than the visual that we easily can incorporate into the moment, and it gives us additional depth. So I think it's probably harder for a photographer to find a unique style than for a writer.
Well, and there's so many different variables that go into that. There's a concept known as repetition suppression, where if you see the same types of photographs over and over again, they become less and less interesting or impactful, especially if it's of the same exact scene or subject. And so I think the further we get into this art form of landscape photography, I think it becomes more and more challenging to overcome some of those barriers. I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about what you think some of the alternatives would be in terms of trying to approach the craft from a perspective of doing something different or offering up a different idea.
There's that old saying, like a picture says more than 1,000 words, which I think if that's true, then you as a writer, you're not really doing your job. Then your 1,000 words are really poorly chosen. But there's also the opposite that says that you can't judge a book by a cover, and I'm a big proponent of that. So I think what the real, it's not a secret, it's pretty blatant, pretty obvious to me, what the solution to some of these problems is the combination of both the word and the image. I think the word can stand by itself. It has for, eons, millennia before visual aids were actually available, or photography was invented, or painting was even invented. But painting was there from the beginning, if you look at the cave art and stuff. So, but the stories, they're able to basically stand on their own. However, they do get enhanced by visual elements, and nowadays our culture is so visually dominated that it's required almost. Like I'll talk about it a little later, I don't want to jump ahead, but when I did my big Arctic traverse, I did not bring a camera deliberately for some of the reservations that I have about photography, and that I didn't want to interfere with the trip. but also I wasn't thinking ahead that in order to promote the books afterwards, I actually do need visuals. So I was in a bit in a quandary there, and I ended up not having a single original photo from the trip. However, fortunately, there was a guy here in Fairbanks who's also a veteran long distance hiker and a former smoke jumper, and he made a video, and he pretty much had the same route that I took, and he made a video of it and allowed me to use some stills from his video to promote the book. So I hadn't thought that far ahead, and I don't know if that would have changed my decision not to bring a camera.
So I'd be curious then, because I feel like there's two competing challenges at play here. On one hand, you have, if you want photographs to stand their ground, they need to ideally be accompanied by words, really good words. And I find that people's attention spans are shorter and shorter and shorter, and their willingness to take the time to actually read something that's well thought out and written is becoming lower and lower. So I'm curious, how do you fight against those competing issues?
You don't. You can't. Frankly, I'm too old to change the culture, and I absolutely agree that there is something going on, like a nationwide or worldwide, actually, an attention deficit disorder that has to do in large part with social media, and they've even noticed that editing cuts in movies are now shorter and shorter, and
Right.
that sort of came out of a fashion that came out of the music video industry, and has now infused even feature films and other productions. So that's not my battle to fight anymore. Luckily, I don't write for that generation, really. I am a boomer, and I love for young people. I try to connect with young people because that was important to me as a guide, as an outdoors instructor, and is important to me as a writer because that is the generation that carries on the torch that I've been carrying most of my life. But it's not my main target audience, and I've even seen it in guided trips that I've worked, that the boomers are the typical backpacking generation. That backpacking was big with the boomers, and my boss told me they're not doing a lot of these hardcore long backpacking trips anymore because there's less demand for it. What is now in demand is these multi-sports activity in one package sort of thing. And I'm not saying necessarily that's a younger person's thing, but it could easily be. So there's that. We get bored with monotonous things, what people consider monotonous things, whether it's a long book that gets into the depth and the nitty gritty, or whether it's a long hike where you schlep a 60-pound pack. So it requires a certain kind of attention span that you actually need to hone, that not everybody has that naturally. It's a skill sort of that you need to develop, and it needs to be part of your philosophy. You need to want to be that kind of person that has time for these things that I consider important. It's the same with photographers, have worked that way too. I mean, look at Ansel Adams. I read somewhere, I don't know if it's true, that before he actually ever took a photo, he went out to a viewpoint repeatedly and just sat there and watched the landscape and saw what the light was doing at different times of day and different seasons. So that attention, and it shows in his photography, it shows in the results.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like that's one of the things that I feel like photography and backpacking can offer to the younger generation, is that it gets them away from social media and those quick hits for a long enough period of time where they can start to recognize some of the physical and mental benefits that can come from slowing down and engaging with nature on a more personal level. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to promote photography in that particular way, is because I think it can help shift the culture with the younger generation.
I don't know if you're familiar with the super blooms down in the desert.
Oh, yeah.
With perennial flowers, they only bloom not even every year, but every other year or odd year when the conditions are just about right. And it's just this amazing landscape of carpets, wildflowers. And of course, now it becomes a photographer's must for amateur photographers and professional photographers. And so they flock to these places and, of course, have their photo taken right in the super bloom, which means pretty much the end of the super bloom, to the point where communities now block access to these areas. So that's an extreme case. Another extreme case in the canyon country that comes to mind is the Horseshoe Bend overlook there above Glen Canyon, or what remains of Glen Canyon, that famous viewpoint where they enlarged the parking lot and people have fallen off the rim to their death to try to take selfies with them in the Horseshoe Bend.
Well, and
So
now it's all fenced off, which makes it even less desirable to visit.
I have not been there in a while, but I floated that stretch for a chapter in my Canyon book, No Walk in the Park, because I wanted to see what Glen Canyon must have been like. And I was waking up in the morning and I looked up, I was camped right below Horseshoe Bend, and I saw flashlights going off at the rim there. They were taking photos, not necessarily of me, but I hope I didn't ruin the picture by being in there.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned Instagram culture, because that's something that myself and several other photographers started noticing about 6 years ago. And so we created a nonprofit called Nature First, where we wanted to develop guiding principles for other photographers to follow in terms of how they engage in their photography in nature, to try to stem some of that. And we got about, I don't know, I want to say like 20 or 30,000 people signed on to say that they would pledge to follow the guidelines we followed. But obviously we're dealing with millions and millions of people here. So it's an uphill battle, no doubt.
And I hold it against the nature photographers a little bit that in my book, they don't get involved enough in speaking out for these places that they benefit from as photographers and then as human beings. I mean, it's the land base that we need to take care of, but the land gives us so much in spiritual and monetary even values, and I feel we almost have an obligation to give back, and yet I see that not much. The 50s and 60s for me were actually the highlight of, or the heydays of, when landscape photographers were involved in political causes, for lack of a better word. I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that the Sierra Club put out a bunch of pictorials by known photographers that actually helped change the tides on political decisions. For example, they were the reasons that several dams were not built in the Grand Canyon and in Dinosaur National Monument. But since then, it's become sort of almost like a specialty. Now it's picking up a little again with climate change. I see more and more photographers incorporating that in their work, and that's a good development, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm super aware of that. I'm not totally sure what the shift has been. I guess it's all of the evils that have come with social media in terms of people wanting to get noticed and wanting their day of fame or whatever. So I don't totally know how to combat that, other than to be one of the silent majority that speaks out against it. So,
and it equals the proliferation of in publications in books for writers. I mean, we have all these with self-publishing now. There's just floodgates have opened, and there's so much work out there that's available. And as a consumer, you have to sift through that to find out the gems among the dross. And I'm sure, so it's this overwhelming sea of stimuli, and it's the same with photography. It's everywhere now, and that's not even incorporating or including films and advertising and all that stuff.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. Well, maybe a shift to something more positive. I would love for you to tell us about your 40-day, what you call failed attempt at the Grand Canyon through hike. Tell us what that was about and what were your goals for the trip.
Well, it came out of the Arctic traverse, actually, that I did in 2012, where I had a solo trip from the Canada's Yukon border to the Bering Strait and Kotzebue Sound in northern Alaska. It was a traverse of the Brooks Range, which is the northernmost, largest Arctic mountain range in the world, and also the largest official wilderness area. It's almost 1,000 miles of just straight wilderness. And that was a project I had dreamed about for many, many years and kept putting off, because as a guide, I could ill afford to take the time off there. A whole summer almost was 58-day trip. I needed to make a living and not be able to, go on an expensive expedition. I did eventually, and I'm glad I did, because you always assume you have all the time in the world, but the news flash is you don't. So I developed a yen for long distance hiking based on that Arctic traverse. And so the next year I went out and wanted to do a traverse of the Grand Canyon on the North Rim, which is almost all trailless, as opposed to the South Rim. And I talk about it a little bit in one chapter of the No Walk in the Park, the new Grand Canyon book that I've put out. But that was a totally different beast. For one thing, so I did not finish it. Spoiler alert here, after only 40 days, I split ways with my hiking partner. And that was the reason that the expedition failed, so to speak. For me, he finished it. He put in another 2 or 3 weeks and finished the thing. But to me, it was just not about the wilderness experience, because he was a very different type of person. I was basically trying to take a break from the hustle and bustle of daily life and some of the things that we already talked about. He, however, was a social butterfly, and with modern technology now in reach, he was constantly connected, checking in with his girlfriend and being on the phone and posting updates. And I remember one time we were climbing in the Red Wall, which was sort of involved climb. We actually had the rope set up, and his InReach or whatever thing went off beeping in the backpack. And to me, that was symptomatic of the whole thing. Plus, it wasn't just him and me, but also he had guest hikers that would come in that would hike sections of the canyon with us. My wife, for example, or then she was my girlfriend, she came in, hiked with us for 2 weeks, and I love her dearly. But every time a new group or even a single person came in, it totally changed the dynamics of the trip. And it just, we were also similar in being very opinionated. And me being a cultural anthropologist, I felt he wasn't sensitive enough about some of the people's beliefs that had lived out there. And I needled him. I said, for example, the Hopi creation myths, they're sort of similar to the evolution theory of evolution is the creation myth of biologists. And he totally, as a biologist, he totally took offense to it. And I was just trying to make a point that there's a different ways of looking at the world and different ways of explaining the world, and that they're just equally valid to the people who believe in them. Whether one is science and the other is myth, that's neither here nor there. So anyway, it was a very different experience, and I didn't finish it. And the finishing was never that big, like the same with the Brooks Range Traverse. It's just I used 1,000 miles because it's a round number. And if you read the book, there's a couple of miles missing, actually, so I didn't finish the whole traverse. And that never was the big thing to me, that completion, that sense of completion. To me, it was the journey and being out there. And I had seen the Brooks Range on 2-week trips that I've guided up there, but I never had enough time to check out all these places that I saw on the map on the way flying in. And I just really, really wanted to spend a long time out there doing a long walk, which also changes you as a person while you're out there doing that and afterwards. So those were the goals, not this, record setting, or people have speed hiked the Grand Canyon in 27 days, the entire length of the canyon. That never was a goal for me. And so for a while I thought about going back and finishing it. And now I don't even feel I need to do that. The last section that I was missing there.
Yeah, it's funny. I did the Colorado Trail last summer, and I did it in 35 days, and I did 30 mountains on the way. So I wanted to immerse myself in the wilderness and get away from life and actually experience what I would like to call real life in nature. And but it was interesting, because you'd run into lots of other people that were doing it, and everyone kind of had their own reasons for doing it and what they were excited about. And then you'd hear about, different, fastest known times, FKTs. And I think the Colorado Trail is something ridiculous, 7 or 8 days or something like that. And it's just I can't imagine even trying to do that, nor would I'm not sure you'd get much out of it other than the sense of accomplishment, beating a record. But it is interesting to think about how people's motivations for doing something changes, how that thing affects them on a deeper level.
I've seen that throughout my, this is the age where you kind of take stock of life and you see a lot of the big picture things. And I realized that as a younger person, I wanted to climb 1,000 different mountains. And now I want to climb the same mountain 1,000 different times. And what that means is I'd like to get to know a few places really, really well. And for me, those are my two spiritual homes. It's Arctic Alaska, the Brooks Range, and the Grand Canyon. And I feel I could spend the rest of my life, and people have spent entire lives in those places and not seen all there is to see or learned all there is to learn. Just think about the Grand Canyon from a landscape photographer perspective. It's the world's largest sculpture with ever-changing light. I mean, how are you going to ever get tired of that or bored or take the same picture twice?
I personally think I would be happy photographing Southwest Colorado and Southeast Utah for the rest of my life.
More power to you.
Like those two places are very special to me, and I don't feel like I really need that much more in my life.
And it's the same for me as a writer. There's the landscapes look so empty and open, but I always say if you could make the stories visible somehow in those landscapes, it would look like a subway map of New York. Right. I just went to Anak Pass, where there's a little native museum, and the curator there, who's a Inupiaq, a Nunamut Inupiaq, had compiled a map of the Central Brooks Range. It was a 30-foot wall map, and he had entered all the knowledge that he talked to people that people remembered. And it went all back from shamans' graves to where the caribou were migrating at different times of the year to the last battle they had up there with the Indians. And the thing looked like a Jackson Pollock canvas. It was so dense with markings. And to me, that's just the human stories. Then I can tell all the animal stories. The geology. Edward Abbey said it would take a whole lifetime to just write the biography of one single gnarled juniper.
I love that.
For a photographer, you have similar challenges if you really go down deep, not just wide.
Yeah, no, I think, and there's different challenges associated with going deeper versus wider, and also different intents and different things you're going to get out of the experiences and things like that. I've just come to know for myself that I have a pretty deep appreciation for a few places on Earth, and I'd be perfectly content spending a lot more time in just those few places.
There's one thing I'd like to go into, if you don't mind me doing so. I really, really get involved because I said earlier, you can judge a book by the cover, and I mentioned that my wife used to be a graphic designer and that 2 of my photos actually have become book covers. And so I learned a thing or two along the way about beautifully designed book covers, and I do tend to get involved to the degree where publishers do not like my involvement, to the point actually where the last book, No Walk in the Park, the Canyon book, I had to pull it from the University of Utah Press because I had a very, very specific idea for the cover, and they were just not willing to work with me on it. And this is where the rephotography comes into play. I'm a huge fan of rephotography. It's been traditionally done a lot to document changes in the landscape over time, where people have used historical, like from the Powell survey expeditions, historical photographs, and then went back and rephotographed the same scene, trying to find the same vantage point and, the same crop of the original photo. And so I'm a huge fan of that, especially when it's done, again, in an artistic way, not just as a documentary thing. And here I really have to mention Mark Klatt and Byron Wolfe and their Grand Canyon book, Reconstructing the View, which is absolutely marvelous because what they did is they used their rephotography and built it into large panoramic photos or even illustrations of the canyon to the point where it blends seamlessly. It's sort of like collages they've created. And not only that, but they have done it with a wonderful sense of whimsy too, which is sort of like my own sense of humor. And so seeing their work and reconstructing the view actually inspired me to want a similar cover for the Grand Canyon book, No Walk in the Park. I sifted through the online historical photo collections of the Klein Library there at Northern Arizona University. And I've always loved the work of the Kolb brothers, who were two brothers who in the 19-teens started a photography studio on the South Rim. And they originally started taking a lot of the photos of the dudes going down on muleback into the canyon. And they ran up to the studio, developed the film, and then by the time the dudes came back up to the rim again, they had their photos ready and sold them to them. But they also did a lot of really out of the way exploring for unusual photography and some really hair-raising approaches to, you think you go the extra mile for setting up your photo shoot. Well, there's one of a log over a chasm, a rock chasm, and one of the brothers is standing on top of, balancing on top of the log, and the other one's dangling with a huge old style camera from a rope from the log and hanging in the abyss, basically taking a photo out there. Anyway, so those are the guys I really wanted to incorporate. And I didn't want it as a gimmick, but I wanted to incorporate that in a contemporary photo for the cover as a way of showing the continuity between adventurers then in the canyon and adventurers now, because that's very much the gist of the book too. I'm talking about my own adventures in the canyon, but I'm also talking about historically the people have spent lives, native people and outdoors people that have spent lives up down there in the canyon. So I found this perfect photo of one of the Kolb brothers on this ladder style tree thing that is bridging a rock narrows. And the photo was actually mislabeled. It said Kanab Creek. And I looked at it and I said right away, this is no way that's Kanab Creek. I know this place. That's the mouth of Havasu in the Grand Canyon, which is the famous stream with the turquoise waters. And it's the mouth of it where I know from experience that's the place, because we always park our boats there when we go up the creek to take the tourists up there for hikes. And I just loved the photo. And I said, now I got to find a contemporary photo to blend this with in the style of reconstructing the view. And I did not have a budget to go down there and take that photo. I knew exactly the place where it was taken from too, because there's a trail that's kind of skinny and it drops off on the one side. And there's very few places where you can step out and look at the scenery. And that's exactly where the Kolb brother had taken that photo. And I knew exactly the place, but I couldn't go down there. And the cover design was due at the publisher or the printer soon. And so I went online and fished the online offerings there, and I found a color photo, I swear to you, that looked crisp and was taken by a former park ranger down there who'd been on an outing, who'd snapped it. So it came with a common creative license. I contacted her to make sure, and she allowed me to use it. And when I had it up on my computer screen and I cut out the historical Kolb photo in a circle, the center of him on that log ladder, because I wanted it to look sort of like somebody looking through a scope or from the rim. They have these scopes at the viewpoints, and I wanted like somebody's looking down into the depths of the canyon and seeing this guy doing this crazy thing. So I had this cutout, this sepia tone cutout, and I moved it on that park ranger's contemporary photo. And at some point it clicked into place. And I swear to you, when you see it, it could hardly have done better had I planned on a photography shoot there at that place. So that made my day, And so I ended up pulling.
How lucky is that?
I ended up pulling the book from the publisher, was a university press, and ended up self-publishing the book just to preserve my vision. And I have never been so much in control of a program, of a project, and I loved every minute of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And tell us a little bit more what the book is about.
It's sort of like the best of my last 20 years of canyon explorations, and also looking at the place and the landscape from my anthropologist lens, sort of like taking on this whole idea of wilderness, which, the Grand Canyon in a lot of places, it's far from wilderness with the helicopter scenic overflights and the river runners down there and the hikers. But there's still places where you feel you're out of this world, you're away from it. When you don't have an inReach in your backpack, of course. So I wanted to tell my stories, and I also wanted to tell their stories and blend the two. Like I said, this continuity of stories and experiences lived in the canyon. There's some unusual writing in there. Like I did with my wife, we did one hike where we thought we were really smart trying to avoid the July heat by hiking from the South Rim to Phantom Ranch at night. And also, not just being smart, but I wanted to experience the different sensations that come with that, because you use different senses and it's even a whole different place. So we did. Needless to say, it hadn't cooled off that much at all. And we ended up having a pretty scary encounter with a mountain lion in the dark down there at Indian Garden, or Havasupai Garden, as it's called now. Another chapter in the book is about snowshoeing on the South Rim, which, if you know the Grand Canyon, that's a very, very unusual occurrence, that their snow is good enough that you can actually snowshoe. And my wife, she was on cross-country skis even, and we timed it just perfect. We were living in Flagstaff, and I've been watching the weather forecast, and then we went out there and the roads were actually closed off inside the park. You could only drive to the main entrance to the rim, and then all the other roads, they were still being plowed. And so we had a perfect morning snowshoeing along the rim there and skiing along the rim. By the time we returned in the early afternoon, it was already all turning to mush. So that was a very rare moment. So I tried to have experiences, a little bit other than the usual kind. Another trip that I'm describing is an expedition with Grand Canyon Youth that I worked for. And we went down there and did fish science for the endangered humpback chub. So one chapter about one of my favorite passions, rock art. I'm big into pre-Columbian rock art. And so there's a whole subculture there. We call them glyphers, after the petroglyphs that they're chasing after, and the pictographs, of course. So there's a chapter called Gone Glyphing. I went for the unusual because I'd already written another canyon collection of canyon essays earlier, years ago, my first book actually, and that was more sort of the traditional stuff. So this time I went a little more out of the limb, like the Koch brothers, I hope.
That sounds awesome. And you spoke to discussing and honoring some of the stories of the indigenous people and the history of the canyon country. I'm curious, from your perspective as an anthropologist, how might photographers such as myself honor some of those similar stories through photography?
That's a tough one because, again, so much has to do with the stories, and the visible impact on the landscapes by the people who live there is often not very obvious. And I mean, you do have the obvious, the rock art and the ruins, and they're often photographed, but those are not the living people that are still living there and what matters to them. So in the 1970s, two anthropologists, Sol Worth and John Adair, single-handedly invented the field of visual anthropology. And they were doing work on ethnographic work on the Navajo reservation. And at some point, I can't remember what their motivation was, but they gave cameras to the Navajo that they had been working with because they were interested in how they perceived their surroundings. And when they looked at the images they got back afterwards, they realized that it was a totally different perception or conception of the landscape that these native people had. So what struck them first of all was that almost all the photos that we would consider traditional landscape photography had human elements in them, which means domestic livestock or family, and it showed not people posing or recreating, but people doing subsistence activities. So those are actually the native stories that need to be told. And like I said, I don't consider myself a photographer, so I think it's up to landscape photographers to figure out how to do this, how to translate this visually. One project comes to mind by a woman named Matika Munro, who is herself a native. I forget what her background exactly is, but she has a project that's called Project 526. And 526 is the number of indigenous tribes that has been officially recognized by the federal government. And so she set out as a photographer to visit all of these groups and document their existence in those places where they ended up living, which to me is a great idea for a project. However, she also even required that interviews. So there is always that need to fill in, because how often do you see a landscape photograph that has some feature in it and you don't know what it is till you see the image caption? So there's again that need of the image and the word to coexist and to work together to tell the full story.
Yeah, and I think to your point, those stories are probably best told by the people with lived experience, not some white dude in Colorado. Not to offend anyone, but like,
Or Alaska.
right? Like, I feel like those stories should be told by the people that have the experience and have the connections and have the perspective of lived experience to be able to tell their story. And I think that's an exciting way for photography and culture to intersect. And I was actually recently at a museum in San Diego, the Museum of Fine Art, and they had an exhibition there from a Native American photographer living in Los Angeles. And her whole project was about kind of telling the story of kind of the intersection between Native culture and modernity, and kind of how their culture has kind of had to walk those two lines simultaneously, especially people like in their 20s and 30s, of course, like they've grown up in modern culture, but they're still expected by their elders to kind of honor their traditions. And so I thought that was a really interesting photography project, and I would love to see more projects like that being done.
That's a very valid point. And there again, it's that thing that landscape photography does not exist in the vacuum. So you have this class issue where, frankly, being an accomplished nature photographer requires a lot of money for the gear, the equipment, and also to travel to some of these places. And that's just something that you don't see commonly happening in there are not enough native photographers out there. And that's, for me, that's the justification also why I, as a white person, am still telling some of these native stories, which I feel qualified to a degree as an anthropologist and having lived and worked with these people. But there are writers out there. There are a lot of native writers out there. They just don't tell the kinds of stories that I'm seeking to tell. And I'm just afraid if nobody's telling them, they might be forgotten. And I still also have the hope that somewhere these stories might make a difference in the direction that our culture is going in, which might be slightly too optimistic. I know you have a recommendation at the end of the podcast where you ask for a photographer. And so I do have two photographers that are actually Native American photographers that are doing that kind of work that I was talking about that we like to see more of. So
I love it. Yeah, go for it right now. That's perfect.
One is Brian Adams, who's a Inupiaq Eskimo. I think he used to grow up in Barrow. Now he lives in Anchorage. And the other one is Kili Yuan. I'm not sure how you pronounce the name, but he is of mixed Native Siberian and Chinese ancestry. And so if you look up their work, they're doing some incredible work. And so it's, again, this distinction, where do you draw the line between portraiture and landscape photography? I mean, their work shows human work or human individuals within a landscape. And I think the division between portrait photography and landscape photography is somewhat arbitrary, but it comes from this Western canon, this, going from the Hudson River School of landscape painting, where humans, if at all present, were just a decorative element or there to show the size of the scale of the environment, versus this native concept of we are part of nature, we are not separate. And so this is sort of artificial, this dividing line to me. And as a writer, the equivalent is this dichotomy between wilderness and homeland. There's a lot of writing about wilderness. And then when you talk about people, oftentimes their idea of wilderness implies the absence of humans. That is wilderness. And if you use that as a yardstick, there hasn't been wilderness in North America in 20,000 years since people first set foot on this continent. And
right.
That's a big, important point that I'm trying to get across. Even when it looks like nobody has been there for ages, people have they have names for a lot of the places that you're seeing in the scene, and they have stories tied to those places, and they go back generations and generations and generations.
Yeah, and that's something I've been trying to do a little bit more in my own photography. Is I live in a part of the country, as you know, that is rooted in a lot of native culture, and there's a lot of landmarks that are in my area that are spiritually connective for those people. And whenever I capture images of those scenes, I'm always trying to do a little bit of research about, like, oh, well, what do the natives call that, and like, what are the stories they have about that place? And I mostly it's just my curiosity, but I also think to some degree we have kind of a responsibility to do that. So anyway, that's my perspective.
And yet those places are sacred to those people. So there is that whole ethical can of worms. Should I just waltz in there and take photos of it, right? Or
Right.
should I ask for me? It's the same as a hiker. There are places in the Grand Canyon that are off limits because they're considered sacred by the Hopi, like the salt mines down by the river, or the Sipapuni there, where they the springs up in the Little Colorado drainage, where they think they emerged from previous worlds into this current one. That's probably the single most. It's the St. Peter's Dome of Hopidom. It's probably the most sacred place in the world. And Deer Creek is a big one too, because Deer Creek for the Southern Paiute is the falls. Deer Creek Falls is where their dead departed this world and moved on to the next, to the spirit world. And here we got canyoneers rappelling down that thing and taking photos of each other. So you see the problem there, right? Something we have to deal with regardless of what medium we're working in.
Yeah, and I don't pretend to have the answer. I just think it's important for people to think about it.
Yeah, to have the questions and ask the questions. Yeah. And have dialogue and involve all the parties concerned, I think.
Right. Well, Michael, this has been really fun. How can people learn more about your newest book and I also believe you have some other books as well. So tell us more about those and how people can learn more about the writing.
I am in a unique situation. I have a trifecta this summer, which pleases me immensely. Not just, for most writers, that doesn't happen once in a lifetime. I have 3 new books out in April, May, and June. They came out, and they're all 3 wilderness-centered books. And to me, that's just perfect, because 2024 also marks the centennial of the first official wilderness area, which a lot of people don't even know, because the common perception is that the Wilderness Act that was passed in 1964 was actually the first big step. But in 1924, the Forest Service designated the first official wilderness area down in the Gila National Forest, New Mexico. And it was because of the involvement of one man who's a literary and conservation hero of mine, Aldo Leopold, author of the Sand County Almanac, who worked down there as a forester and who was the first person in Western civilization, in my book, or to my knowledge, that realized the importance of predators for a functioning ecosystem. Even so-called conservationists like Theodore Roosevelt, they were still anti-predator and trying to wipe them out because they were competing with the hunters, trophy hunters like him. But Aldo Leopold, he killed that wolf in the famous scene in the famous essay, Thinking Like a Mountain. He was the first to formulate the land ethic that native people already, of course, had practiced for thousands of years and known about, but he was the first to formulate that for the Western world. And he should be read more widely. And I go back and reread him every year or every other year for the message, but also for the beauty of his prose. He's an amazing writer. Yeah, so 2024, big year. And the books, you can find them through my website, michaelengelhard.com. One of them, the Canyon one I mentioned, is No Walk in the Park. There's another one out right now called A Walk in the Park that's getting a lot more press. Then I have a Alaska essay collection. So the book and the equivalent to that, the best of the last 20 years from adventures in Alaska with culture and history mixed in. That's called What the River Knows. And then the memoir, long form, which I don't write a lot in, I'm mostly an essayist, the long form book, memoir, Arctic Traverse, 1,000-mile summer of trekking the Brooks Range. They're all 3 available, should be available at bookstores. If not, ask for them. They might carry them when they hear about them, or go to the website or the publisher's website.
Awesome. I'm going to go.
But read Aldo Leopold before you read mine.
Okay. I'll go look at my bookstore to see if they're carrying your stuff. And if not, I'll tell them to start carrying it.
And I'll always be a fan of landscape photography, and I'll always keep exploring and complaining about it. But
Awesome.
the same is true for writing and writers. I'm a very critical person, and I think that comes through in my writing, but I also like to keep a sense of humor, and I hope that comes through as well.
Well, I personally think we need more people that are critical, and I appreciate it. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Matt, for a great show.
Thank you to Michael for the great conversation. I had fun bantering with you about these topics, which I think largely go undiscussed in most photography circles. Hopefully, we have shed some light on some of these topics and given people something to think about. I'm also looking forward to checking out your books as well as your recommended readings from Aldo Leopold. I'll put links to all of those things in the show notes for listeners to check out. Cheers. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.